Welcome, everybody, to the webinar with Professor Manuel Barcia on his latest book, The Yellow Demon of Fever, Fighting Disease in the 19th Century Transatlantic Slave Trade, published by Yale University Press. It is my pleasure to introduce Professor Barcia and conduct the discussion. So I'm gonna introduce him, then allow him a few minutes to talk about his book, and then we will move to the Q&A session. And if you'd like to post a question, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So Professor Manuel Barcia is chair of global history at the University of Leeds and editor of the journal Atlantic Studies. He graduated with a BA in history from the University of Havana and continued his graduate education with an MA and a PhD in history at the University of Essex. He is the author of The Yellow Demon of Fever, Fighting Disease in the 19th Century Transatlantic Slave Trade, but also of West African Warfare in Bahia and Cuba by Oxford University Press, and Seeds of Insurrection, Damnation and Resistance on Western Cuban Plantations, 1808 to 1848. These are just some of his books and publications. In 2014, he was awarded the prestigious Philip Leverhulme Prize in History, given every year to researchers whose work has already attracted international recognition and whose future career is exceptionally promising. He has been visiting fellow at the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University, and a non-resident fellow at the Hutchins Center, Afro-Latin American Institute at Harvard University. He has also been a member of the advisory board of Slave Voyages website and a contributor to several publications, including the Washington Spectator, the Huffington Post, the Daily Telegraph, and Al Jazeera English. So please join me to welcome Professor Manuel Barcia. Thank you very much for being with us, Manuel.
Thank you very much for coming. For those of you who are in Texas time, I know this is your lunch time, so it's much appreciated. I would like to start by thanking Daniel, Eric, and John for organizing the talk and also for being here. So I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible because I'm a big believer in having conversations rather than me parroting for say half an hour or something. So I'm going to say a few things about the book and the methodology and how I came to idea, etc., and some conclusions or learnings that I had to share, and then we can have a discussion. So I should probably begin the talk by making very clear that I didn't plan for finishing a book in the middle of a global pandemic. That was a total coincidence. The book obviously is on disease, and epidemics are a big part of it. So I have found myself talking quite a lot about this topic, even though I do not consider myself a historian of medicine. I make a point of telling everybody that I'm kind of an outsider in these fields, and I don't know how far I will go in the future. But I really think that there are some lessons that are to be learned from the past, and in this case, I had the opportunity to read quite a lot about disease and the struggle against disease in transatlantic slave trade in the 19th century, and many of the stuff that I came across over the years, over many years, working on this book. It's kind of a bit of serendipity, if you wish. I have found myself dealing with similar issues as the people who are in my book dealt with since this global pandemic began. So the same fears, the same anxieties, the same concerns about all kind of stuff that they had. I have them as well. But I also identify a number of things that actually also we have seen in the last few months or last year We have seen how cooperation can lead to medical breakthroughs. We have seen how governments implement measures of all kinds, some of them effective, some of them completely ineffective. To a certain extent, um, in an attempt of engineering, social engineering, the way people live, and in the hope of either um, stopping the epidemic from spreading, or at least giving an image, an idea that they are actually doing something, because they are both of them. So I spent many years working on archives. I have spent my entire adult life working on archive, actually. And working on the slave trade and the slavery, I continue to find information that related to the medical history of the slave trade and slavery. And I always wrote these things down, which is probably something that I shouldn't be saying in public, because I tell my PhD students and master students not to do that. I always tell them focus on what you are working, not don't start copying everything. But I did, and at some point I actually came to a fork in the road, and I decided that rather than using all this information to inform my research on other topics, that maybe I should write a book on that. And of course, it was a huge challenge. I had to read quite a lot about medical history that I was not familiar with. I had taken medical history courses during my PhD and my master's, but um, they were a good basis, but I had to learn much more. But I think that the thing that really tempted me to do this book was the opportunity to do something that I always wanted to do since the early part of the century, which was to write circum-Atlantic history. So most of Atlantic historians, me included until now at least, they have been writing cis-Atlantic history, transatlantic history, to use the concepts of David Armitage in that article from 2003, I think it is. But this was an opportunity to actually bring people and places together. And it had many challenges. The documents were spread all over the Atlantic and beyond. I had to contend with different languages as well, with different historiographies, and everything had to be brought together and make it fit. And that in itself was a very interesting challenge, something that I actually struggle with at times, but I also enjoy for most of the time. Historiographically, I also find another challenge, which is that most of the medical history of the transatlantic slave trade that we have until today is for the pre-1807 period. So what comes after 1807, when abolition starts being implemented in the Atlantic, that is not very well studied. And to a certain extent, this is a result of the very fact that most of the transatlantic slave trade activities of a period are illegal. They are being done in a way in which they are not recorded in official documents, etc., etc. There is still information, okay? I'm not saying that there are no documents out there. There's quite a lot, actually, but it's not as rich as it is for the preceding period. So I pretty much try to avoid following this romantic narrative of the white Western medical doctor superheroing his way across the Atlantic and saving everybody, which unfortunately is something we have seen quite a lot in the past. I rather try to focus on the life and contribution of ordinary people, people who are usually lost to history. And I actually pay special attention to the histories of non-Western, non-white people, especially Africans in this case, Africans both in Africa and in the diaspora, and how the knowledge of medicine was both theoretical and practical, was very often accepted, was learned, and was even implemented by Western practitioners. I was not interested either in offering the sort of Whiggish narrative of the rise of good medicine or the progress of medical knowledge just because medical discoveries and breakthrough take place. The line of the medical progress is not a linear thing. So we have seen you can go back. As a matter of fact, something that I was planning to say later on in this talk, but I'm going to say it right now, since I fell here for some reason, is that you can actually see this very clearly as to how people take vaccines. In the 19th century, in the period that I'm studying, I cannot remember a single instance of somebody refusing to take the vaccine, the smallpox vaccine or inoculation. everybody, regardless of what cultures they were from, they would take it. They were happy to take it. And yet we have today a brand new anti-vax movement, very often founded in bad science or non-science, that is actually hampering efforts to vaccinate the world against this disease and other diseases like measles, for instance. So there is not a linear progress of medical knowledge, and this is something that I wanted to make clear. Something that I found out very early on when I was doing this book is that diseases were a common enemy, right? They were probably the only common enemy that all Atlantic actors of a period had in common. Slave traders, people who were opposing the slave trade, and all those caught in between. And because they were deadly, because they would attack everybody equally or almost equally, they foster cooperation in the face of necessity, right? People had to come together to fight these diseases. So one thing that I found out very early on when I was trying to put together my ideas for this book is that people were cooperating more than that they were competing, they were disagreeing. The slave trade, of course, was in itself a process of removal, of displacement, and taking people from one part of the world to another obviously created new disease environments, disseminated disease, et cetera, and therefore the slave trade in itself, it fostered this kind of the spread of disease. So by focusing on how these Atlantic actors interacted with each other in what Mary Louise Pratt has called the contact zones, these spaces of colonial encounter where people exchange knowledge, exchange information, exchange literature, but also exchange sweat, exchange blood, etc. We can actually see, and also how they share fragmentary knowledge, which is also a concept by Pablo Gomez, we can see the ways in which medical cultures are going to evolve during the period, right, in this area. One final result that was kind of unexpected out of all this is that I realized very early on as well that the implementation of abolitionist policies in the Atlantic actually, in the day-to-day, caused quite a lot of suffering and human pain. And that was because slave traders were forced to go on the ground, to go to protect their own activities, and this caused much more suffering. We have countless accounts of Africans who have been enslaved, have been taken to the coast, starving in barracoons along the African coast because the European navies were blocking the coast and they could not be exported to Central Americas. Experimentation also took a whole different level in the transatlantic slave trade, in the legal slave trade. This is the age of heroic medicine, and this heroic medicine in the transatlantic slave trade is more like heroic medicine on steroids. So you have something really magnified here. So all these interactions are going to create new fragments of medical knowledge, new fragmentary medical knowledge that eventually is going to become part of the medical corpus that people who came after inherited. Right, so methodologically speaking, I focus on 4 stages of the struggle against disease. The first one was prophylaxis, and prophylaxis related to a very wide array of measures taken to avoid the setting out of disease or the spread of disease, from the measures, environmental measures taken at the time based on the idea that miasma was the cause of of many of these diseases, which meant that they would drain swamps, they would cut down forests, they would seek the wind, etc. They would try to sanitize with chlorine, with vinegar, with whatever they could find, to more policing measures that related to the moral and social behavior of people. So measures related to having sex, to being exposed to the sun, to drinking alcoholic beverage, to eating too much. So it was a wide array there of human behavior that needed to be policed as well, right? I also look at diagnosis, which is, of course, the nosology of disease, how diseases are named. And of course, this is a crucial part of medical knowledge. Once you're able to identify and name a disease, you're able to have a better idea of how to treat it and what the outcome is going to be. So this became a very central part of what was happening here. But of course, in this period, many of the diseases that we know today that have been pinned down with specific names were still, for instance, with fevers, we have a wide array of fevers. And sometimes actually the names get confused, the symptoms were confused. So it's a very confusing period. Therefore, the outcome of the disease and the treatment were always uncertain, very often uncertain. I also look at prognosis, which is obviously the outcome of these diseases, and the treatment and the therapies, how these diseases are going to be treated. And of course, this is a period in which trial and error is taking place, but also where new treatments are being brought in and replacing old treatments at this time, at the same time that they actually live together. I look at these developments in three main environments. The first one is slave ships, or are slave ships and slave factories, mostly in the coast of Africa. And the reason that I put them together is because precisely because of the amount and quality of information did not allow me to have full-fledged chapters for each of them. So I thought that it made more sense to bring them together. So these were slave ships and slave factories were riddled with overcrowding, poor hygiene, medical facilities were disastrous, medical provision was equally terrible. Very often they didn't have practitioners at hand, not even local practitioners. I also look at anti-slave trade patrol ships from different nations, not just British, but different nations. And these ships, they were the first line of containment against these diseases. Usually they came in direct contact with ships that were already suffering diseases, and very often they caught these diseases on land, actually. There were several epidemics of yellow fever, for instance, in the Atlantic in the 1820s and 1830s, and very often British ships or Spanish ships were the first ones to bring this disease into the region. Finally, I look at the reception centers, at the anti-slave trade reception centers in Africa and all over the Atlantic. These were places where also disease was rife, but also they were better organized. They had to deal with an ongoing disaster, if you wish, but they had medical supplies. The medical supplies were more forthcoming. The medical infrastructure was more suited to deal with these diseases, as so was medical provision, right? So to start wrapping this up, all this led me to reach a number of conclusions, which I'm going to try to share with you very briefly as well. As I mentioned already, cooperation is going to be central to this story. And this is not a cooperation that goes in one way, in one direction. This is not the Europeans or Westerners, because there are Americans and Brazilians here, arriving in Africa, for instance, and sharing their state-of-the-art knowledge with Africans. This is not how this story goes. This was a story in which both parties were equally capable. Surgical knowledge, for instance, in many cases was way more developed in Africa than was by Europeans. But also was the knowledge of pharmacopoeia and many other treatments, some actually practical treatments as well. So there was a process of learning, there was a process of exchanging information, there was a process of experimentation as well that took place, and all of them are going to be a common feature of what is happening here, and they are all going to be contributing to these changes in the medical cultures of the Atlantic at the time. They were all, of course, deeply affected, as I said before, by African knowledge, by African practices, by African methodologies, etc. One more thing that I came across, and I think that I cannot finish this without mentioning, is that medical knowledge in this period is going to be also, to a certain extent, a weapon of sorts, right? It's going to serve all these Western powers to settle in Africa and to expand later on. Alison Bashford actually has this concept of the dream of hygienic containment, which is part of what I have been looking at. And for instance, the lines of hygiene that they are going to be established by these powers in these settlements first, and then as they expand, are going to be turned into boundaries of rule, right? And they are going to be turned into boundaries of rule either by imposing free trade, which is obviously free only for those who are imposing it, or gunboats, right? There are only two ways here. So this is proto-colonial war, proto-colonial African war, right? There is no there are no European African empires at this point yet. There are just beachheads here and there. So this dream of hygienic containment, to use Alison Bashford's term again, definitely hit an expansionist agenda, right? And this expansionist agenda allowed them to have access to new markets for the products, allowed them to control populations, which were already under the control, but also allow them to effectively to expand territorially. So all these things are going to be part of this struggle against disease in these places, and they are going to be you can see them almost in every Atlantic corner. So to finish, I just want to share a couple of things that I think that I learned from our ancestors, and that they keep coming to me these days as we start coming out of the COVID epidemic. The first one is that cooperation is key in the fight against disease. And that was the case in the 19th century, and it is the case now. We have seen how vaccines have been put together, how different countries have come together to work together to be able to actually contain this epidemic. We have seen how in those moments when cooperation broke down, and for example, President Trump walked away from WHO in the middle of a pandemic, and that actually had an effect, a domino effect on what happened afterwards, can hinder the effectiveness of the struggle against disease. So that's one thing. Another thing that I think that we can learn from our ancestors, and we can actually quite learn a lot about our ancestors, is that caring for each other is really important. And this caring for each other also involves making sacrifices at times. So our ancestors were very clear about this. Even those, and this is not an easy thing to say for me, but even very often slave traders, because they had an investment on the human cargo they were carrying in the Atlantic, they actually made sacrifices to get these people alive on the other side of the Atlantic and make money. They may not have cared about the health, because they obviously didn't care about them as human beings. But my point stands that we need to make sacrifices to take care of each other. Very often it's not about ourselves, it's about other people and their fragility, about the fact that they may not deal with a disease that is a killing disease in the same way that younger, healthier people can. And the final thing, and with this I'm going to close, is that I really think that it's very important to follow scientific advice. And if there is one thing that I constantly came across while producing 19th century sources in the Atlantic, regardless of where they came from, is that people were always keen of being up to date with the state-of-the-art medical knowledge, scientific knowledge, and they tried to follow it as much as they could. And this, as you know, is not the case for us today all the time. So I'm going to leave it there. So I'm happy to answer questions and open the floor. Thank you.
Super, Manuel. Thank you very much. We're now going to open the Q&A session. For those who join us more recently, please use the Q&A button to send your questions. Okay. As you key your questions, I will maybe start with one of my own. Well, first, thank you very much for your presentation. This is terrific, very exciting history you just told us. But just to give you a chance to elaborate a little bit more on the last point, or one of the last points that you made about making sacrifices. And in this context of the slave trade, I can understand why some in our audience may find that difficult to understand. So I was wondering if you could give us some examples of sacrifices that you were mentioning.
Thank you. Well, it's something that is going to happen constantly in for instance, on slave ships. We have to remember here that both slave traders, and that involves slave ship crews, and uh, anti-slave trade patrols, which usually they come out in a much better light when we examine them. They are both having something in common. They have a financial investment on those Africans they have on board the ships, right? And there are all kinds of people here. So you can it's very difficult to tell today because not all of them wrote, not all of them were able to express why they did the things they did. So it's very, it's not easy to say the reasons in every single opportunity, but you can see that there is a human side to every story. And even though, in my opinion, the most important reason for these people to keep their Africans alive was the financial side of it. They were going to make money. If they arrive healthy, if they arrive in a good shape, the larger number they arrive, the more money they would make. So it was the same for the anti-slave trade patrols. The more Africans they would take in good conditions and alive to one of the reception centers, the higher their payday. But they are actually, in order for this to happen, they are actually going to put their lives on the line. And this is not something that we can take lightly. Many of these sailors are not even going to, this happens quite often. Many of these sailors are actually involved in the slave trade and they are not even aware of what's happening. Very often they are going to be in a ship that is doing other things and suddenly is hired to go to Africa. Or it's going to Africa for another reason, and it ends up loading the ships with enslaved people because this is the opportunity that presents themselves. We have cases about this, and that doesn't exonerate them. On the contrary, actually, we have one case in particular, the case of the Jesus Maria in 1841, which is a coastal ship from the Canary Islands, a very small ship that sees an opportunity to take a slave cargo to the Americas, and this is potentially the most vicious transatlantic slave voyage ever. The worst things that I have read about the transatlantic slave trade are all present in this voyage. And these were not slave traders, okay? These were sailors who were trading potatoes in the coast, along the coast of Africa. But my point is that very often you see that that some of these crew members are going to put their life in the line to keep the Africans that they are carrying alive. They are going to feed them, they are going to give them medical care, etc., as much as they can, and very often they are going to die in this situation as well, right? So it's not, actually many of them are going to be, in Brazil we have a classic case, there was a name for this, sangradores, which were Africans, or African descendant people who were part of a slave trade voyages, and they provide this medical support. So it's what I'm trying to say is that it's not a one-dimensional history, and even though they were making they were making money by keeping these Africans alive, still they are putting their lives on the line, and not all of them are actually making huge amounts of money. So I try to see always the glass half full, and I try to see a bit of humanity even in the worst situation. So it's what I've seen pretty much. But it also happened the same with anti-slave trade patrols, pretty much. I mean, you see the same kind of racism there. You see the same kind of abuse there as well. So,
thank you. A question here that is more of a scholarly nature. So you refer to medical cultures. Maybe you were thinking about Atlantic medical cultures. Is it too early to sponsor that idea? And if it's not, how would the transatlantic slave trade fit into that field of Atlantic medical cultures?
I think that there are, well, first, thank you very much to start with. I think that we could potentially refer to Atlantic medical cultures, and I actually discussed them, and I didn't come to this term lightly. I actually had long discussions with historians of medicine, historians of slavery and medicine, which I'm not going to mention here because I don't want to put this on them in case that goes out. But well-known names and good friends of mine, good colleagues. I think that that there is a potential for discussing this because there are medical cultures. So what I do think is that these medical cultures, which are all going to be integrated. So they're coming from different empires and different parts of the Atlantic world, which are not necessarily European of European origin. They all have a contribution to make, and in many ways, some of the experimentation that is going to take place in this environment is going to make a significant contribution to what happens later. I mean, I was having a conversation about this recently with a colleague. One of the doctors who is going, or probably the most important doctor who is going to identify the vector carrier of yellow fever is a Cuban doctor, okay? His name is Carlos Juan Finley, and he's going to identify the vector in the 1880s, and he's going to prove that in the 1890s, very, very late 1890s in Havana, after the Americans occupied Havana, right? And he's going to do that in tandem with a number of American doctors, famously Dr. Reed, who is going to take most of the credit. But he already has this theory from the 1880s. What often doesn't come up in this story is that Finley doesn't come out of nowhere, right? Finley is a grandson of a British medical doctor, and I think that his father was also a medical doctor. This is a medical doctor that goes to Havana in the 1830s as the doctor of the Mixed Commission Court, of the Anglo-Spanish Mixed Commission Court in Havana. And after feeling that he's not being paid what he should be paid for dealing directly with Africans who have terrible diseases coming from the Atlantic, he's going to walk away from the Mixed Commission Court. He's going to buy a plantation. He's going to buy slaves, and he's going to become a slave owner. So it is, as you can see, it is again not a one-dimensional story. This is Finley actually had his medical knowledge, his medical culture had an Atlantic background, and this can be identified in many ways throughout the period, and you can definitely take it to a much earlier period as well. So this is not something that happened only in the 19th century either. So yeah, I would probably insist in using the term. I think that there is a very, very strong argument to use it, but you know, like everything else, we put ideas out there and we see what happens. Maybe somebody can prove that it doesn't work.
Yeah, super. Thank you. We have a question here now from Professor Lan Li in the Medical Humanities program and the History department. Thank you very much for this talk. Would you be able to speak more about your work on disease nosology and the broad taxonomy of fevers that you encounter in the sources?
Thank you very much, Lee. You are basically asking me to describe the most reliable source of headaches I had for years. It is extremely complicated, right? It's incredibly complicated. Now, if we are dealing with any sort of disease, fevers, let's use the fevers, okay? You know, when you're dealing with a yellow fever, you know when you're dealing with malaria, you know when you're dealing with typhoid fever, with typhus, you can actually tell them apart as soon as you do a test. Back then they couldn't. And some of these fevers actually, at different stages, they have very similar symptoms. I actually have a theory that is a very wacky theory, and I will never be able to prove it, but still I keep saying it, because you never know, maybe somebody can prove it. I still have this wacky theory that typhoid fever was perhaps the biggest killer in the transatlantic slave trade and not malaria. But that's a talk for another day. So basically, medical practitioners in the transatlantic slave trade are trying to do the best they can with the knowledge of the time, dealing what they call remittent fever, intermittent fever, hospital fever, black fever, you call it, right? You name it. And of course, because they look very similar, they are going to try similar treatments, similar therapies to deal with these fevers. And I'm going to give you a very interesting example. There is this American doctor from Yale University. he goes to Monrovia, to Liberia. I think it's in the early 30s, 1830s. And this guy, I actually like him. He has this really, really open mind, and he's um, um, very keen on doing things that other people have not done. So the one thing he's going to do that I actually find quite interesting is he says, you know what, I am not going to waste my time with bloodletting anymore. I am not going to waste my time with purgatives. I am not going to waste my time with mercury. From now on, whenever people have fevers, I'm going to use one remedy and one remedy only, quinine, right? And it sounds amazing. And he probably saved plenty of lives by doing that. But quinine may work with somebody who has malaria, but it may not work with somebody who has something else. And malaria is very heavy to take. So if you're suffering of about some other fever and you have malaria in your system, probably it's going to make you feel worse, if not something worse than that. And of course, malaria was used in different ways, right? We know that quinine was used in the Atlantic since the 16th, 17th century. But even in the 19th century, you can see that they are using it in a very specific way. So when somebody was attacked by the African fever, another way of calling these fevers, basically this person was likely to be given mercury first and foremost until there was elevation, and then they would be given purgatives, and there would be there would be the victims of the Lancet. There would be bled significantly. Once they were weak enough, then they would be given quinine. And at that time, of course, quinine could literally kill them. So the way that these treatments link up with the way these diseases are identified is still something that needs way more study than what I managed in this book. It is clear that fevers as a category are going to be a mixed bag. Maybe you can separate yellow fever to a certain extent because yellow fever have very specific symptoms, but as you know, typhoid fever actually has similar symptoms as at some stage people are yellow. So it really created a problem for the practitioners of the time to be able to name what disease was affecting people, especially when it came to fevers. And it became a problem for me to be able to make sense of what I was having in front of me. With other diseases, was much easier. Smallpox, for instance, was very clear. Dysentery was not always dysentery, but you could at least say that this was that they have intestinal problems of what either bacterial or viral, etc., etc. So there are diseases that you can identify very easily. Sleeping sickness, for instance, and for which you can have more or less a prognosis of what's going to happen, depending on the treatment that you have. But very often they would just guess, you know.
All right. Super. Thank you. Professor Luis Duno Gottberg here asking, can you expand in other forms of medical knowledge that informed response to disease in the slave trade? And then he expands.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, just follow up. There is a body of knowledge generated in Africa to deal with disease. So how does it reflect in the practices of the enslavers?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Luis. It reflects remarkably quite a lot, actually. From a very clear instances in which Europeans are going to just quit European medicine, and there is a very interesting case that is going to be kind of mind blowing for all Europeans. The Portuguese who settled in the coast of Mozambique, I think it's in Quilimane specifically, in the mid 19th century, they decide to quit European medicine completely. They don't use any European medicine to treat the diseases. And there are at least 2 or 3 people who visit the region at the time, and they all come up with the same. They are just using local medicine, local remedies, and they seem to be doing quite well, actually. But beyond that, and Kale Kananusha has just published a book on this, by the way, there is quite a lot of botanical knowledge that is going to be incorporated into the medical corpus, not only of the Atlantic, today's medical corpus, actually. It's going to be taken to the Americas as well. It's going to be part of many treatments that are going to take place at the time and even now. It's going to be, in the case of Brazil, for instance, it's going to be a link with Candomblé. In the case of Cuba, it's going to be linked with Santeria. Judith Carney and Rosomov, I always forget his name, they have written a marvelous book about these transfers of botanical knowledge from Africa to the Americas. But this knowledge is not just botanical. This knowledge involves physical treatments, for instance, the ways of giving a massage. Europeans are going to learn, Westerners are going to learn from Africans how to massage. It's going to involve surgical knowledge. We have evidence of Europeans or Westerners, I cannot say whether they were from the United States or not, actually saying that they had learned how to amputate limbs from Africans. These are medical doctors from Europe or the United States who had come into contact with Africans who knew how to amputate limbs, and they were doing so in an effective way, and they had learned the method from the Africans. But beyond that, there was also very specific surgical knowledge associated with African diseases. And one that I used more than once in the book is how to extract the Guinea worm, which is a very specific surgical procedure that requires quite a lot of skills that no Westerner had done. So they had to learn this from Africans. And like that, immediate things, and millions of things. You can see it almost everywhere. The African knowledge, and this is an argument that I actually try to make quite strongly. The African knowledge is just as important as the Western knowledge in this period, even though usually hasn't been portrayed as such. And the reason for that is that whereas many Western medical practitioners and other people, officers, etc., visitors, travelers, they are going to buy into it, and they are going to see the potential, and they are going to try to incorporate it into the medical corpus. Others are going to dismiss it out of hand. They are not even going to bother to look at them, maybe because they are associated with an African dance, which was performed before the medical procedure was performed. There was quite a lot as you know, and I didn't used to use this word before, but now I use it all the time. There was quite a lot of racist takes on Africa at the time, and they reflect on how Europeans are going to, or Westerners are going to interpret this African knowledge very often. But again, it's a mixed bag. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. A question from Professor Lisa Swirlo. Thank you for this marvelous talk, Manuel. Could you speak about the place of gender knowledge of disease in the archives?
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa. Thanks for being here, by the way. Well, you know, this has been probably the most difficult thing for me to find gender and to place gender into the whole story. And I think that probably the main shortcoming of the book, for me at least, I think that most of the information that we have was bequeathed to us by Westerners who visited Africa or who were involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but there's very little written by Africans. And even those times, most of information is related to men, to medical practitioners who were men. And I am absolutely, completely convinced, and I had this conversation before, that women play a much more important role than what it appears in the sources, what it is recorded in the sources. But as a historian, this for me is a silence that I can only point to. I cannot fabricate information. So whenever I found information related to gender, I made sure that it made it to the book. But you would, if you read the book, you will see that there is not a significant amount of it. There is some that you will, if you read the book, you will see it there as well. But more often than not, it's a very male dominated story, and it's a story that is usually told by white males as well. You have the occasional white woman telling stories as well, but this is also a story told and written very often. The sources are written by white males, with the the expected consequences of it. We do know that women play important roles because there are references, but there are no descriptions beyond the fact that they are referred to, and that's a significant problem. I didn't work on plantations, by the way. If I would have worked on plantations, probably I would have found more, I'm pretty sure, but I was focusing on the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah, that question made me think about documents and references that we sometimes see in the archives or in the literature of the slave trade about the birth of children on slave
Yeah,
ships or at the barracoons and
yeah,
so on. And uh, because your book is very much focused on the yellow fever issue, I was wondering if we paid attention on on the birth of children and the potential role of midwives, including enslaved midwives, we would get more information about women's knowledge,
yeah.
women's medical knowledge in the slave trade.
Yeah. Again, for this period, there is not quite a lot about this. The book is not just about yellow fever. I mean, the title suggests that it is. Um, it's more like a stunt title because it's really more about disease in general, although there is a specific focus on fevers. Um, and this is a phrase from a mixed commission judge that refers to all fevers as a yellow demon, but not to yellow fever as such. Anyway, but it creates the illusion that I'm talking about yellow fever. No, to be honest with you, there are cases of women giving birth on ships, and I think that I actually at least have one in the book. There are cases of children being thrown overboard just after being born. Not sure whether they were alive or dead, but there is very little for this period again, and because again we have to remember that this is an illegal period, about the work uh, of midwives. I did find a very interesting reference actually, and I tried to check with everybody, and no one actually came through with another reference, similar reference uh, about plans to stop the menopause, the period, not just for abortion, as we know. There have been quite a lot of written about this, but plans that actually would stop the period of the African woman before they were put on the ships, to avoid women having period during the Middle Passage. But this is one reference, one single reference. That is not wide. And I remember posting in Facebook and in Twitter and asking everybody, and no one came through with another case or anything written about it. So this is just scratching the surface of something that may have been common.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I don't recall any reference myself, so I'm sorry, I won't be able to help you there.
At least I didn't lose a reference, you see.
Yes, yes. Okay. I was curious about, again, towards the end of your presentation, when you were discussing that this knowledge sort of helped pave the way, perhaps, for colonialism, because it allowed Europeans to settle down on the African coast and maybe
Yeah.
even sail up a river, right? And when you mentioned that, it came to my mind immediately uh, the studies by Philip Curtin, where he talks about that this knowledge uh, came in the context of European armies being sent to Africa in that very early stage of the conquest and partition.
Yeah.
So, would you say that the knowledge coming from the slave trade preceded or supplemented? I mean, how would you place that in this
I
competing
think
narrative?
Yeah, I think that there is a very strong argument, and this book needs to be written, by the way. There is a very strong argument to claim that European, both the transatlantic slave trade and its abolition, both sides of the story, are going to play a very, very important role on what happens after 1850, 1860, and especially in the 1880s with the partition of Africa. I actually finished a book with a phrase from a British surgeon, something Robert Clark, I think his name is, and he was for many years in Sierra Leone, and then he goes to the Gold Coast, and for many years, we're talking about 20, 30 years in Africa actually, and in the late 1850s, he's actually saying that Africa should not be referred to anymore as the white man's grave, which was usually a moniker that was used to refer to West Africa and Africa in general. And this is basically because quinine has become more widely used. It has been more effectively, efficiently used by the time. And this is going to allow for Europeans to settle in Africa for longer times and to survive, because before they were dying one after another. That's the reality. Very few people would actually make it. Some people would die within days. Quite a lot of people would die within days. So quinine is going to play a very important role here for this place. But if you look at what's happening, forget about the slave trade, focus on abolition, look at what's happening here. In 1851, the British occupied. First, they bombed, and then they occupied Lagos or Onim, so they can kick out the local ruler and put the puppet ruler, because the local ruler was involved in the transatlantic slave trade. So he gave the British a reason, very compelling reason, to occupy Lagos. But the British are never going to leave. Eventually, it's going to become a protectorate, and eventually, it's going to become a colony. And this is a pattern that is going to be repeated across Africa ahead of 1885. And you can see the French, who at the time have what David Todd refers to as an informal imperialism, and with a magnificent book that just came out, by the way, A Velvet Empire is called. And at this time, the French are sending their Royal Navy ships, which are engaged in abolishing the slave trade, along the African coast, scouting potential places to settle down and to have beachheads colonies, or whatever you want to name them. So this is not just a case of the slave trade. This is also a case of the powers that be, which are engaged in abolishing the slave trade, taking advantage of these to expand their empires, their colonial ambitions, or just to create conditions to access new markets in advantageous ways, through what they call free trade, which of course again was not free, was only free for those who wanted to implement it. So it's pretty much
we have 5 minutes left, and I was wondering if you could speak very quickly about your next project.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, well, I'm writing about pirates, or more precisely, I'm writing about the abolition of about the suppression of piracy, and probably should do like this, about the suppression of piracy across the planet in the 19th century, pretty much in the same period. And again, the arguments are very similar. I'm actually looking at how in different parts of the planet, and this includes the Atlantic, and this includes slave traders, who in many cases are doing this human trafficking in violation of treaties that have declared the transatlantic slave trade as piracy. So how different European powers are going to take advantage of supposedly acts of piracy to repress, to expand, to create new settlements all around the world. So this is in a nutshell, this is what I'm doing right now. And it's a project that is, again, is trans-imperial. It involves pretty much the entire planet, and it's quite a challenging one. So
a global campaign.
Yeah.
Super.
I say in the same period because at least something had to be familiar. And I just found out that there is a new film coming out, which is called Edge of the World, which is presenting James Brooke, which is one of these British adventurers who goes to Borneo and start murdering people for fun. In his time, he was considered to be a criminal. And they have made this film of him being like, a great adventurer who fought against pirates and headhunters. So we are in for a treat.
Yeah.
Another.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Manuel. This has been fantastic. A great pleasure to host you here at Rice University via Zoom. I hope that next time you're actually able to come to campus.
Yeah.
I would like to thank the support from the Department of History and the Department of Modern and Classical Literatures and Cultures. I'd like to thank also our team behind the scenes, John Waterhouse and Eric Granquist. Thank you everybody for coming and participating of this event. And I wish you all a wonderful afternoon.